my first time in Georgia, to Krizisi, and I'm enjoying it very much so far. I'm going to speak about the financial crisis. I'll leave lots of time for discussion and questions and things like that. The world economy in crisis. Now I'll talk about international monetary reform. I want to preface my remarks with just something about the international monetary system. For most of history, since coinage began back about 800 BC, the world has had a kind of international monetary system that's usually been because currencies have been tied together through a common denominator in the precious metals. Several metals were used for money, but the money that was most prevalent was, of course, silver and gold. And as long as countries denominate their currencies in the same metal, then currencies became names for different weights of gold or of that whatever metal it was. So, for instance, in the 19th century, the pound sterling had about 4.86 times as much gold in it as the US dollar. So the exchange rate was about 4.86. That was the traditional exchange rate. Plus or minus a certain amount for transport costs and things like that. But because of that, the world had a kind of monetary unity. And what that meant was that all countries tied to gold or to gold plus silver in the financial system. It meant that the world business cycles went up and down together. All countries moved in the same thing. If you look at the past history of 250 years, you'll see cycles of price levels in all major countries that were tied to one of the precious metals, going down and up and down and up. Do you know what we call that wave, that long wave in history? Named after a Russian, Kondratiev, who was one of the pioneers in business cycle research. And it seemed to be every half century to be a period of deflation and a period of inflation, a period of deflation and inflation. What that reflected was the appreciation and depreciation of the precious metals relative to commodities. So you got gold production, some new gold discoveries, you have got some inflation. When you had a long period of growth without discoveries, you got deflation. And then something else affected the picture very much, something which I call the Thornton effect after the economists in the 18th century, is that sudden changes in the demand for metals, countries going off or onto the gold standard, would affect world prices. So those had a big effect. For instance, at the time of the French Revolution, the world was tied to gold. Well, let me go back a little further. In about 1750, the British were conquering India. And the British put India onto the silver standard. So the Indians started to collect a lot of silver as their money instead of brass and copper. And that created a deflation in the late 18th century. And maybe that was one of the causes of the American Revolution in 1776, and maybe even the French Revolution in 1789. And then the French Revolution came, and France was the biggest power economy in Europe at this time. And the French went off gold and silver completely. And that gold and silver went to the rest of the world, and so prices went up. So rising prices. Then at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, countries went back to gold. So prices, the demand for gold went up, prices went down. Then in the middle of the 18th century, you had discoveries of gold in 3 places. In the 1840s, in the Ural Mountains, not so far from here. And then in California, and then in Australia. And so prices went up. And then they stopped going up, gold went on, and you got a period of long period without any new discoveries, and you got a deflation. And then you got, finally in 1885, the discovery of gold in South Africa. And in 1890, the new gold system, the cyanide process for extracting gold out, very important, 1890. So you got, suddenly you've got all that South African gold coming onto the market, and you've got rising prices. Maybe that had an influence indirectly in causing World War I and so on. But you see these big undulations. But all the time, the world economy operated, with some exceptions, as a coherent unit. And that was so true when, in the 1920s, World War I, countries went off gold, and prices went up, as always, and then they went back to gold in the 1920s, and then that caused the Great Depression. There was deflation, because all the European countries went back to gold and had been properly prepared for it. And then World War I broke out, World War II broke out, and you got then a new international monetary system. It was different in a way because it was decided legally at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. The 44 nations gathered together and established the International Monetary Fund. What that did was to establish a unit of account, which was again gold, but it was a different kind of gold standard because it was now one country, the United States, had become, which is a country south of where I grew up. I grew up in Canada. That country had now become bigger than the next 3 or 4 biggest countries put together. So that big economy then started to dominate, and the dollar started to compete with gold. And then so what happened then, the way the International Monetary Fund system turned out after World War II was that the U.S. had fixed the price of gold, but the other countries weren't using gold anymore. They fixed their currencies to the U.S. dollar. So we got a kind of dollar standard. And then in 1971, the gold, that system broke down because the price of gold has been fixed in 1934 at $35 an ounce. 1934. 30 years later, 35 years later, around 1970, world prices had tripled because of the wars. World War I, Korean War, Vietnam War, the secular wars, secular inflation, and world prices tripled, the price of gold stayed constant. So there was a shortage of gold. Nobody wanted to increase the price of gold for various reasons. So countries went off gold. We moved to flexible exchange rates. So the world, since 1971, has been without gold and without a fixed exchange rate system. No longer countries, currencies move together. No longer do prices move together. You look at prices all of the different countries all over the world, the major countries, and they have their own individual inflation rates. Different because exchange rates change. And the exchange rates are also big differences in exchange rates. But in all the previous period, all major countries went up and down together. Now, since 1971, they all moved differently. There are now 186 members of the International Monetary Fund, and they represent something like 170 currencies. Now, 16 of those currencies are in the Eurozone, so 16 of those countries don't have any individual currencies. So about 170 currencies, but it means that there are 170 different currency areas in the world and 170 different price levels in the world. So there's no coherent monetary system, and that makes a big difference. That's the background to what I'm going to talk about here. I'm going to talk about the financial crisis, the one recently. But I want to put in the context of that absence, that big problem that we don't have an international monetary system. We don't have a world currency. The dollar is one of the major currencies, but also there's the euro. The dollar and the euro are the two major currencies. But and they make do is they give some kind of coherence to the International Monetary Fund. Just imagine what would happen. Imagine what would happen if you had 170 currencies in the world and all the countries were about the same size. Imagine how many prices there would be in the world. You'd have something like, when you count all the prices, you'd have something like 15,000 prices in currency prices, just to name them all, because n times n minus 1 would give you the number of individual exchange rates that would exist with that large number in the system. So it creates a great deal of chaos. But what gives some coherence so that our system isn't much like that is that the dollar still is a major unit of account. Not perfect, but it's better than nothing. At least there's one currency there, or the euro, the dollar or the euro. But the dollar is the one that's been the historic currency. Now, with that in mind, this is the kind of system we're into. I want to talk about the financial crisis. Financial crisis started in the summer of 2007. It was reflected in the great liquidity crisis that developed in 2 days. This is now almost 2 years ago, August 9th and 10th. Suddenly there was awareness of troubles associated with the subprime mortgage assets. People realized that suddenly banks realized these terrible assets in their balance sheet, and they wanted liquidity to cover those assets in case there was a shortage, a stopgap. So there was this tremendous demand for liquidity. I'll come to it in a minute. But it was a year later that you got the major crisis. And you got this big liquidity crisis in the summer of 2007. But the great financial crisis in the United States on the banks and so on was more than a year later. Why did it take so long? Why was it take, after that big awareness, did it take a whole 13 months before you got the liquidity crisis? That's what I wanted to get into. Well, the early origins of the crisis go back to the Federal Reserve policies used to cope with the global slowdown of 2001 and 2. Alan Greenspan was the chairman of the Fed, one of the best 3 chairmen, I would say, in Fed history. He'd been criticized back in 1990 for being too slow in that recession, that slowdown came. He was too slow in easing up. And so he overdid it this time. He eased up too much, and it started creating the bubble. Now, with low interest rates, low dollar, housing boom developed. And then something special happened. As long as house prices were rising, there was a cushion of safety between mortgages and house value. And what it meant is that American governments have always pushed housing. They think it's socially good if everybody owns their own house. Many people own their own houses. It's an element of security and stability in the system. Well, with prices rising, banks were willing to give mortgages that were 80%, 90% of the value of the house, because with prices going up, there was a cushion of value between the value of the mortgage. And that was fine. That was what was creating the bubble. But as soon as house prices started to rise and started to fall, turn around, then that created a big problem. Now, what was, I call it 5 flies in the ointment. 5 financial innovations were going on at this time. Securitization of mortgages. Instead of mortgages being local, tied to the lender and borrower in the same place, know each other, it became securitized. And with the instance of them being securitized was really insurance. They were insured against this through credit default swaps. That was the insurance thing that did. And the derivatives were magnifying the multiplier in the whole system. And then the mark-to-market accounting rules, which were put on after the Enron crisis. The Enron crisis in 2002. Enron was the biggest bank failure in world history at that time. By the way, it was 1/6 of the bank failure of Lehman Brothers 8 years later, 6 years later. But in Enron, one of the big criticisms and the cause of the bank is that they failed to mark their assets. Their assets had gone down in value and they failed to mark them up. So the regulators established the idea that everybody should mark things to market. And that turned out to be a big problem. Also, variable rate insurance was a big problem. So the securitization of mortgages cut the link between the issuer and the owner. The derivatives created new systemic risks. Credit default swaps enabled insurance without ownership. And then mark-to-market accounting and investment accounts created intertemporal instability and balances. So when the house prices stopped rising and began to fall, the boom ended. When house prices fell below mortgage values, homeowners walked away from their mortgages. Now, Europeans are astonished at that because you can't do it in Europe. If you borrow money, you take out a mortgage, you buy a house, and then the value of the house falls below the mortgage value, you can walk away from it. But when your house is then sold at an auction, if the value, you get the value of the house back, but if it's lower than the value of the mortgage, you have to pay the difference. The individual is responsible. But in the United States, no, this is not. Banks were responsible, so it's very the problem. Subprime mortgage assets then became toxic, creating a devastating hole in the balance sheet. But then, sudden awareness of the problem in the summer of 2007 created a massive balance sheet problem for banks, amounting to hundreds of billions of dollars. Mark-to-market accounting rules forced them to cover the holes. The scramble for liquidity was completely unprecedented in the annals of finance. Financial panic was about to occur. Something like a sudden demand for money, euros and dollars and good money, hundreds of billions of dollars. If you had any kind of rigid gold standard, the whole system would have completely cracked up. But we have a very elastic balance sheet system. The international monetary system is very elastic. When there's an excess demand for money, central banks can supply the money, and that's what they did. The panic was averted by prompt action by the European Central Bank. It offered unlimited credit at 4% on August 9th. 95 billion euros, that's $140 billion, were lent at that rate. More came from the Fed and other central banks when their markets opened later, and the next day the lending continued. So in those 2 days, these are astonishing figures. Something like $300 billion when you cut all the central banks, added $300 billion of high-powered money to the system to bail it out, and it reverted a collapse. The prompt actions of the European Central Bank and the Fed, we call it the Fed, it's the Federal Reserve Board, of the United States, and others in August 2007, solved the liquidity problem at the time. What remained was the solvency problem of those institutions with big holdings of those defaulting assets. After the resolution of the liquidity crisis, there was relative quiet for 13 months. The great expansion of 2002-07 came to an end in the United States, with the great slowdown in the fourth quarter of 2007, in 2008, and a near recession. Now let me just pause for a moment on that, because this period, in the Greenspan expansion, 2007, 2002 to 2007, was a 5-year period, with probably the greatest expansion in global history. Every country was moving ahead rapidly. Every country had rapid growth. Not just the United States and the Euro economy in Japan, in China, and in Britain, every economy was moving rapidly forward. All the emerging market economies were in great shape. There were lots of dollars. The U.S. had a huge current account deficit of $800 billion. This was bringing money to the rest of the world that they added to their reserves. Nobody needed to borrow. At the Singapore meetings of the IMF was, the biggest subject was, what would they do? How would they solve the problem of the IMF didn't get any money. If nobody borrows, the IMF doesn't have enough money to meet its expenses. So they had to try to find ways to do it. But now this great expansion, which was so tremendous, came to an end in 2007 and 2008 with not a recession, but a slowdown. There was about 0.5% growth in those 2 quarters of 2007 and 2008. But it was definitely, it felt like a recession, even if it didn't go into the negative territory that qualifies for a recession. But then came in 2008, the second quarter, that's just a year ago now, the second quarter of 2008, you got growth of 2.8%. Initially people thought it was 3.3%, later revised to 2.8%. So you got expansion coming. It looked like a recovery was coming. And all this looked as if we just had a normal slowdown, a dip, and then we were going to move ahead slowly. But instead, we got the big financial blowout. You have to try to understand what is it that caused that financial blowout. It's a mystery. It seems like a mystery, but it's not a mystery. It's easy to figure out. Instead of recovery, in the last half of 2008, we got the greatest financial disasters in American history and an unambiguous recession with 2 consecutive, well actually now 3 consecutive quarters of negative growth. In 2008, the last 2 quarters of 2008 and the first quarter of 2009. You got negative growth in those 3 full quarters. Definitely a recession, and a very big recession. Then Lehman Brothers collapsed in the middle of September. Its demise was the biggest failure in world history. Previously, as I said, Enron had been the biggest failure. But the Lehman failure was 6 times bigger than Lehman. Than Enron, so you've got a sense of this. The most serious cost of the failure of Lehman was a colossal increase in the demand for money on the part of both banks and the public. Money became even tighter. Credit became unavailable except for super solvent firms. Credit for ordinary enterprises dried up. Then 2 questions arise. What put Lehman Brothers in danger? Why did the Fed and Treasury let Lehman fail? Well, Lehman was too big to fail, but the Fed and Treasury let it fail. It was just a mistake. I think everybody realized letting Lehman Brothers fail was a mistake. It put other institutions at risk and made the takeover of AIG, the American Investment Company Group, the biggest insurance company in the world, at a cost of $78 billion inevitable. Now, as I said, the economy was recovering in the spring. Bear Stearns had been a problem, but the Bear Stearns deficit investment bank was solved by that time. It came right in the middle, in the winter of 2008, and then by May it had been completely solved, taken over by J.P. Morgan. So that wasn't the issue. Why did the financial crisis occur? Why did it happen to come about in August and September 2008? What caused the debacle that September? Well, there's the price of gold going down. That indicates over that period, just over that period, that indicates tight money. Here's what happened. The dollar soared. The dollar soared by 30% at that point. The euro had gone up in June of last year to a high point of $1.64. And then by the end of October, the dollar had soared, and the euro had gone down to about $1.23, a low point of $1.23. So this is what happened over this period. The soaring dollar, euros per dollar, went from July 15th from 63 cents to 80 cents. It's about a 25 to 30% growth. The dollars per euro went down from 165 to, and gold dropped by 260 ounces over that period. 30% drop in the gold price. Well, the soaring dollar and the falling gold price were symptoms of a great shortage of dollar liquidity. And the Fed recognized this shortage and bought foreign exchange to prevent the appreciation, or gold. There would probably be no financial crisis in the fall. Instead, the dollar appreciation overvalued the U.S. dollar assets, including all fixed income securities and mortgages, tipping Lehman Brothers and other banks over the edge. So the soaring dollar and falling gold price were symptoms of the shortage of gold, shortage of dollar liquidity. So now, the Fed then cut off the economic recovery in 2008 and tipped the economy into 3 full quarters of recession and financial crisis. The biggest blunder in Fed history. The Fed's done this before, though. The Federal Reserve has done this before. In the middle of the Great Depression, the economy was starting to recover in 1935 and 36. And then the Fed tightened again and brought about a secondary depression in 1937-38. That was another mistake they made. Now, this is an analogy. I'm making an analogy to the early 1980s. I won't go into that now, but the analogy is very close. The tight money of the summer of 2008 reflected in the strong dollar and low gold brought panic all over the world and a flight to the dollar that brought a halt to bank lending. It wasn't just an increase in demand for money. It was not an increase for bank money. It was an increase for high-powered money, Federal Reserve money, and people were shying away from banks. Similarities are great because oil prices exceed all of massive fiscal costs. Now, this is the main point I'm making. Now, here I mentioned something earlier about the international monetary system. I just say this about it because I think it's at the root, lies at the root of this mistake that the Federal Reserve made. You have a system, the International Gold Standard. I guess you can see it there, 1873 to 1914. You could ask, what happened before that? Before that, there was a bimetallic system. Bimetallic system, where you get a bimetallic system is where the price of gold in terms of silver is fixed. There's a fixed bimetallic ratio. You get that whenever a country, when one or more countries, a big country, keeps the price of gold in terms of silver fixed. Well, in the 19th century, there were 2 countries that were keeping the price, they defined their currency in terms of both gold and both silver. That was the United States at the beginning since 1792. And also France. Napoleon put, well, even before France had been on a bimetallic standard, but Napoleon put France on a bimetallic standard in 1803. So France was the big country, then America was the little country in 1803. French was the superpower in the world. Napoleon. So France had the. So what made bimetallism work was at least one country has both gold and silver. Well, by the middle of the 19th century, both France and Britain and the United States were the two countries. In the middle of the century, the United States had become a big country again, as big as France, and then it was becoming the superpower by the middle of the century. But then America went under the Civil War and went off gold and silver completely. So France was no longer helping bimetallism. And then in 1870, France and Germany went to war. France and Prussia went to war, the Franco-Prussian War. And France went off the gold standard. So no country was off the gold standard. No country, France went off the gold and silver standard, the bimetallic standard. No country was on bimetallism, and that's why you start off with all major countries gravitate to the gold standard. And that lasted until 1914. Then you had the interwar, going off the gold standard during the war, going back on, and then you had the Bretton Woods system, 1945 to 71. And then flexible exchange rates from 73 to 99, and then you had the creation of the euro. The euro started to change the system somewhat because the euro created an alternative to the dollar that weakened a little bit the dollar, shared responsibility with the system. Now, no major banking crisis existed under the gold standard or under Bretton Woods. There was some little crises like the 1890s and 1908, but they weren't systemic crises. They didn't affect the whole system. All the countries in 1910 were in this great gold standard system. Common price level throughout the world. Then in the period from 1934 to 71, it's I call it the Bretton Woods system. Bretton Woods was in 1944, but after the gold standard had broken up in 1930s, the United States went off gold, and then it fixed the price of gold at a higher level at $35 an ounce. So from 1934 to 1971, the price of gold was fixed at $35 an ounce, and that was what established the nature of what came to be called the Bretton Woods system. Because the meeting at Bretton Woods didn't create a new system; it just endorsed the system that had already come by natural forces into being. And then that system broke down because, as I mentioned before, of the fact that price level went up and gold became underpriced. But no major banking crisis under either the gold standard before 1914 or under the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates. But you get four major crises under floating. This is the period of floating exchange rates. You can look at these globes as, or circles or spheres as monetary powers at this time. In the biggest sphere is the U.S. It's more or less the areas of these circles correspond to monetary power, which is proportionate to GDP, to gross national product. The biggest monetary power is by far the dollar area. And then the second biggest economy was the Japanese economy. And the third biggest was the German economy, the Deutsche Mark, that currency. That's the way things were at that stage. You can see the relative power of the United States dollar in this system. It's overwhelming. The only serious rival is the yen, and the yen is way behind, about a third of the GDP of the United States, less than a third of the GDP. So you see the power there. But under floating that period, you've got four major crises, and they're all connected with big swings in exchange rates. 82, the international debt crisis. 82, 83, the savings and loan association crisis. 97, 98, the Asian crisis. and then this recently the financial meltdown, all associated with big swings in the exchange rate. Now, after the euro, let me go back to, that's before the euro. See, look at the part on the, to the right. The European countries are tied together, and their power is dissipated because it's like, a currency area is like an alliance. When countries gather together, they create a bigger power. And the monetary power is created here. You see what happens, how the euro suddenly becomes, instantly when it was created, it became the number 2 currency in the world. It overtook the Japanese yen. And the euro area, now if the US area today represents GDP of about $14.5 trillion, the euro area represents 12 trillion. The yen area, the Japanese currency, represents 4.5 trillion. And the RMB Chinese area represents 4 trillion. And then the 5th largest area is the pound sterling, the British economy. That's number 5 in the world. So, and then of course you get down to Russia and Canada and so on, India and so on. But the big 5 in the world are those that group. The question then, people have been talking about a year ago, a year and a half ago, everybody was talking about, is the dollar era over? Is the dollar going to be an inflationary currency? They talk about it still. Is it going down? Here's what happens. We look at from 1970 until 2008. I put this line of a trend in there. I'm not sure that that's the real line. It could also be flat by some criteria. There's no scientific way of deciding that that's a downward trend or an upward trend, but I think it's quite plausible right now. Not a bad idea to think of it as a downward trend, and that the dollar is going down at this point. But it's not clear. You could have a turnaround coming and different things. Now, what are the harmful effects of big shifts in exchange rates? You get enormous redistributions of wealth because currencies denominate debts and assets. The dollar system benefits the U.S. in the short run, but it hurts it in the long run. Dollar weakens with easy monetary policy during recessions and strengthens during boom. That part of it is harmful to Europe and other countries. Well, here's we come to issues of what should we do in this crisis that we have. I put my finger on the one of the goats in the system, the Federal Reserve, because they brought the crisis on themselves by following an too easy a monetary policy last summer, and not recognizing the appreciating dollar, and not the falling gold price and the tightness that was being created. Had they not done that, there wouldn't have been anything like this crisis. Now, the other side of it, there's another side to it. That you could say that last summer, if the Fed had not tightened over that period and not allowed this appreciation to go on, the price of oil would not have come down. The price of oil over this period of appreciation came down from $148 a barrel down to $25 a barrel. An astonishing instability in the price of oil. Just as the previous upsurge in the oil price was very unstable, the downward is unstable. But that comes about in large part because of the instability of the dollar-euro exchange rate. Now, to cope with this recession, I think that one of the most important things that we could do, I have a lot of proposals for local policy, but when I'm thinking about the international counterpart, Obama set up a counterpart, an economic recovery board chaired by Paul Volcker, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, or And that is the committee that he said, I think there should be an international counterpart to that we need an institution that is going to look, we should take a big lesson from this crisis and have urgent, as soon as we have a steady monitoring of what's happening, and take steps very early on to try to avert some of the very costly crises that are going on. Remember, the cost of this crisis to the world economy is in the tens of trillions of dollars. Probably, the global GDP is something like $60 trillion, $60,000 billion, something like that. And the cost of this crisis spread over these of all countries is probably going to be at least, I think, $15 trillion, just a colossal waste of resources. So we need to do something to stop it. Right now, the U.S. economy, I think, is reaching a bottom, but the recovery is likely to be slow. People talk about a V-shaped recession, down and then up. There's no way that's going to happen. Closer to an L shape, where you get almost no recovery. It might be the U.S. economy hits bottom, but then drags along the floor of that bottom for several months more. And no rebound, because you're not going to get a big rebound in housing. You're not going to get a rebound in automobiles. There's a glut of automobiles over the next 2 years. The automobile companies all over the world are going to be in difficulties. You're not going to get a recovery of investment. You don't get a big expansion in the United States unless you get a recovery of investment, but you don't get that unless you get profits. Big corporations are all making huge amounts of losses now. I've argued, I'm not bringing into this lecture, I just want to mention it, that over the winter I was arguing with Paul Volcker and others that the most important policy thing they should do, forget about all the other policies about the expansion of the fiscal package, stimulus package and so on, doesn't really do very much, would have been to either eliminate or cut down drastically the corporate profits tax. Because the corporate profits tax is a big stumbling block to the promotion of investment. Last fall, the Secretary of the Treasury, Paulson, said that, well, maybe the government needs to buy into American corporations, take some shares in American corporations to help them to recapitalize. That's an absurd idea, because right now the U.S. government is into American corporations. They own 35% of the profits. It's the corporate profit tax. They already own 35% of the corporations. In fact, they don't get shares from them, but they get that share of the profits. And what they need to do is to cut that down, and that would do a great deal to stimulate the economy. So the big cut policy shift, big cut in the corporate profits down to 15% is what I would suggest from 35%. Germany, I would say, Germany cut its corporate profits tax from 25% to 15% last year. Did a big swing around from Germany, and the Americans should follow in its lead. And stabilization of major exchange rates, the dollar-euro rate is the major thing. People talk about creating an SDR system, a basket of the four major currencies. But it doesn't, you're never going to get a global currency based on a basket of four things that are wildly fluctuating. It would only work if you could stabilize the currencies within the basket. And then you would have the ingredients of a genuine reform of the international monetary system. I think it has to start with the stabilization of the dollar-euro exchange rate. And before, I've been suggesting that you put a floor on the euro and the dollar in terms of dollars. And the U.S. put a floor on it of $1.20, and the ceiling on the euro of $1.40. So, and then have the American Central Bank, Federal Reserve, buying up euros at $1.20, and the European Central Bank buying up dollars is $1.40. And this would be a way in which you could stabilize this. Then after you've done that, then it's really pretty easy to go ahead and stabilize the dollar-euro rate. The Chinese currency is already stabilized against the dollar. They've been stabilized for several months again now after 3 years of floating. And now they've stabilized it, and you have quickly on the way to getting a reform of the international monetary system comparable to what existed back in the days of Bretton Woods and earlier under the Gold Standard. Thank you. What policies should Georgia follow? Well, the policies are limited because what I think, first of all, there's no mileage, not much mileage can come from monetary instability. Nothing much comes from that. There's not really very much can be done in terms of fiscal expansion. First of all, it creates deficits and it creates weakness and expectations against the currency. Right? But I think that the policies that should be used are policies that will help will start now to prepare Georgia for when the recovery comes. I think that I don't know enough about Georgia to be specific, but Georgia, let's say, has a population of 4.5 million people. It's got a labor force something like 2 million, 1.9 million people. Means 3 million people don't work. But so the activity ratio, that would be a low activity ratio. But with the 2 million, what are they working at? What are the 2 million, almost 2 million people? What are they working at? What jobs do they have? Well, half of Georgia is rural farming area. So let's say half of that is in the rural sector. But the rest of this there has to be some kind of industry. Of course, service industries are there, and there are some export crops, but exports in Georgia are $1.5 billion, about $1.5 billion. That's not nearly enough in the long run to generate the kind of income that you want in order to sustain a higher per capita income, higher productivity. You've got to have higher productivity. And the only way in which you're going to get that, I think, is toward some process of industrialization, processing industry. I don't mean, not talking about making automobiles, I'm talking about doing what other countries that have developed. And I think that the time to start that is in the period now when Georgia is in a recession. And of course, why that's going to be important is that if there's a movement in that direction in Georgia, then this is going to be more and more attractive for foreign direct investment. And you need to, foreign direct investment, everybody knows that Georgia needs more foreign direct investment. But it's not going to come in. It's not going to come in unless there's profit opportunities, unless the groundwork is being made for a development plan that's going to move forward. And foreign direct investment, I just read this morning in the newspapers, fell in half in the first quarter. So it doesn't look very promising for the rest of the year. You have to do something to make this more inviting. I can't say what industry it should be in specifically. Certainly, of course, you have great potential wine industry continues, but I think Georgia should look at what happened to Finland. Finland, when it joined the European Union, it was cut off. It lost its huge market in the Soviet Union, and what was then the Soviet Union, and they turned around and they redirected their industry in their exports to the West. And of course, they have now some great firms like Nokia and others that are I think that looking at what they did is a kind of example for a country with about the same size population. But of course, Georgia is further away from the vortex of Europe and the technological center, but the education and the movement in the direction toward light manufacturing, trying to get some industries that will increase employment in a good way, that would be the direction in China.
You are interested also about monetary policy. Would you recommend
Yeah, well, the direct, aggressive monetary policy only leads to, of course, inflation, and that's not a good. You probably had that before. All the former Soviet Union countries suffered huge amounts of inflation after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And Russia were the most. So inflation's out the way. I think that talking about this earlier today, a very attractive route is to because a lot of debts in dollars. Dollars are the thing. Stabilizing the currency to the dollar, I think, is the way to go. But I'm not going to suggest that you do that immediately, but I think that you think ahead to a plan of stabilizing the currency to the dollar and finding the exchange rate is going to be comfortable in doing it. And when the dollar rose last time, dollar soared last summer. This must have been very difficult for Georgia. It was difficult for a lot of countries in other former Soviet Union countries who related their currency to the dollar. Like, for example, Kazakhstan. When the dollar soared in the United States, the U.S. economy, financial markets went way down for that period. That was the very period of the crisis. And so did the financial markets in countries that were fixed to the dollar, Kazakhstan and others, and certainly countries like in the Gulf area that were all stabilized in the dollar. So all those countries in Hong Kong, all those countries that were stabilized to the dollar during that crisis period suffered collapses and big falls in the financial markets. And so now Georgia's let its currency go down, depreciate by 15%. And I think that probably was in the right direction. As I say, the Fed, I think the Federal Reserve made a mistake. But I don't think in the long run, the Federal Reserve is going to make big mistakes. And I think that Georgia is too small an economy for its currency to be independently floating. After all, you can take the currency exports are $1.5 billion, for example. Think of how that compares to the amount of money that Bill Gates has got, or Warren Buffett. They can buy up the whole currency supply by this but any individual speculator could rig the market or move the market in some ways. I'm not going to say they're going to do it, but just saying that when a country stabilizes its currency to a very, very large country, it does it so in a secure way that there's confidence in it. It takes on the power of that country. The Hong Kong dollar has been stabilized to the U.S. dollar since 1983, and the Hong Kong dollar is just as stable and has a lower interest rate than the U.S. dollar. So that's a symptom that Hong Kong, little Hong Kong, country, an area of 7 million people, have the currency that is just as useful as the U.S. dollar. So small countries can take on the benefits of big currency areas if they stabilize the currency. You could argue that Georgia could stabilize its currency to the euro as an alternative. That would be the other possibility, but in my opinion, the euro doesn't have the same financial market that the U.S. does. The New York financial market is much more developed. There are a lot of Europe still has some immature financial areas. There's no euro treasury bill. There's no euro treasury bill issued by the euro area. You get Portuguese treasury bills and Italian treasury bills and German treasury bills, but you don't get, so it's not the same thing. It's an immature market. So I think that I would put my money on the dollar, and also the dollar is the U.S. is the best ally to Georgia, so that would be the way in which I would go. But I wouldn't do that immediately in the crisis. I'd wait till over this next few months to see what happens. You want to make sure that Mr. Bernanke doesn't do what he did last year again. If he does, if the dollar starts to soar, then in this crisis, because he starts to fear inflation more than the unemployment that's going on right now, then the dollar goes up, the price of gold goes down, financial markets will create problems in Georgia as it does in all the other countries.
Next question. Thank you. My question is like this. International Monetary Fund advised Eastern European countries to exercise without further joining the Eurozone. Do you think this might be the solution for these countries from financial crisis and for Georgia's economy, like small, open, emerging economy with high factual dollarization and some political risks also here? And which monetary policy is better for Georgia? Float, fixed, peg, currency support, or just dollarization?
So, normally, I think that what the experience of the euro has been, that all of Europe, all the countries that are in the eurozone have weathered the financial crisis better than those countries outside it. There's been at least stability. There's no question of insecurity about the currency, or obviously not exchange rate, because the exchange rates are all gone. What some of the countries have suffered, though, and I'm talking now not about the new countries in Eastern Europe, but about Italy and Greece and Spain. Each of those countries have major problems in adjusting because they've had heavy debt. The public debt over GDP ratio is very high. It's over 100% in both Italy and Greece. So that's been a major problem for Italy during the weak Italian economy. probably if Italy and Greece were not in the Eurozone now, they might have had a big devaluation. And now they haven't done that, and they can't do that. So they have to maintain stability within their own system. Now, the problems of countries like Hungary, and I don't know about the Czech Republic, but Hungary is a terrible state. And I think that Hungary is quite away from being ready to join the Eurozone. I think its finances have been badly managed, and I listened to some reports of it this morning, and I was appalled at what had been happening in Hungary. And I don't think that Hungary is ready for this yet. But you look over, it's not true at all. Slovenia is in relatively good shape. The cost of every country has been suffering a little bit, but Slovenia has done pretty well. I guess Latvia and the Baltic states, very big problems. And I think that they're on their way to getting in because, for example, Estonia had a currency mark system as early as 1992 with the Deutsche Mark. And they've really maintained that, but the economy is in pretty bad shape. But it doesn't mean the economy is in bad shape. It doesn't mean that it would be better if it was not in the Eurozone, because they would suffer from different sets of problems. Probably those countries would have lapsed into a substantial amount of inflation for that period, and that would have maybe spread the misery in a different way, but I don't think it would have been better for the economy. The real thing that I've learned from this crisis in a way is that, and I've been a pretty strong advocate of countries joining the Eurozone, is that it's not a good idea to join immediately, join it during a crisis. I think it's good for it to embark on any kind of advance toward like a fixed exchange rate zone, to wait till the crisis is over before it's done.
Fortunately, we don't have the time to spend too much to another appointment. Let's simply come out there once again.
ტელევიზიაში ციგნი. დანარჩენი კადრი.
კორპორატ ექსებიალა შეაცვლა დაუწევად.
აი ხუთავად. აი გავიგე კორპორატ ექსებიალა. დაბიდო ისკებში
Shouldn't